Hello everybody, hello teacher. Today we're going to discuss the investigation of the role of the spinal cord in the regulation of motor functions of the organism. Mehdi will start with the introduction.
Okay. Introduction. The spinal cord is a long, fragile tube-like structure that begins at the end of the brainstem and continues down almost to the bottom of the spine. The spinal cord consists of nerves that carry incoming and outgoing messages between the brain and the rest of the body. It's also the center for reflexes. It encloses the central and canal of the spinal cord, which consists cerebrospinal fluid. The brain and spinal cord together make up the central nervous system. The enclosing univertebral column protects the relatively shorter spinal cord.
Main functions of the spinal cord. 1. Motor functions directs your body's voluntary muscle movements. 2. Sensory functions monitors sensation of touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. 3. Autonomic functions regulates digestion, urination, body temperature, heart rate, and dilation contraction of blood vessels, blood pressure. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that emerge from the spinal cord, 8 cervical pairs, 12 thoracic pairs, 5 lumbar pairs, 5 sacral pairs, and 1 very small coccygeal pair. In this picture, we can see the spinal cord, which starts from the brainstem and ends at the coccygeal. And at the right, we can see the cross-section of spinal cord, which reveals white matter arranged around a butterfly-shaped area of gray matter. The white matter consists of myelinated fibers or axons that form nerve tracts ascending to and descending from the brain. The white matter is grouped into discrete sectors called funiculi. And we can see the sensory posterior root or dorsal root and motor anterior root.
Okay, before we start with the spinal reflexes, we should mention some important terms. First, monosynaptic and polysynaptic. Monosynaptic is only one single synapse between the sensory and motor neurons. It doesn't have anything between them. But the polysynaptic, it has an interneurons between the sensory and motor neurons. As you can see on the left picture here, on the left side, we have the sensory neuron have a synapse with a motor neuron without any other neurons interacting them. On the right side of this picture, we can see that the sensory neuron is connected with an interneuron. This is a polysynaptic. Polysynaptic may be one or more interneuron connected. Ipsilateral and contralateral. Ipsilateral is a sensory and motor neurons on the same side of the spinal cord. The contralateral, the sensory and motor neurons exit and enters on opposite side of the spinal cord. As you can see in this picture on the right side, the sensory neuron enter the spinal cord via the gray matter, then the gray matter it exit on the same side via the motor roots. This is called ipsilateral. It makes a C shape. But if it exit on the opposite side, it's called the contralateral. Then we have the reciprocal innervation. Reciprocal innervation is a neural circuit simultaneously causes contraction of one muscle and relaxation of its antagonists. Intersegmental is a single sensory neuron activates several motor neurons in several segments of spinal cord via ascending or descending interneurons. These two terms we will explain them later when we talk about the spinal reflexes.
Organization of the spinal cord for motor functions. The cord gray matter is the integrative area for the cord reflexes. Sensory signals enter the cord almost entirely through the sensory posterior roots. After entering the cord, every sensory signal travels to 2 separate destinations. The first, one branch of the sensory nerve terminates almost immediately in the gray matter of the cord and elicits local segmental cord reflexes and other local effects. The second, another branch transmits signals to higher levels of the nervous system, to higher levels in the cord itself, to the brainstem, or even to the cerebral cortex. Each segment of the spinal cord at the level of each spinal nerve has several million neurons in its gray matter. Neurons are of two types: one, anterior motor neurons, and two, interneurons. First, the anterior motor neurons are located in each segment of the anterior horns of the cord gray matter. They give rise to the nerve fibers that leave the cord by way of the anterior roots and directly innervate the skeletal muscle fibers. Second, the interneurons are present in all areas of the cord gray matter in the dorsal horns, the anterior horns, and the intermediate areas between them. The interconnections among the interneurons and anterior motor neurons are responsible for most of the integrative functions of the spinal cord.
Receptor function of the muscle spindle. Each interfusal muscle fiber is a very small skeletal muscle fiber. However, the central region of each of these fibers, that is, the area midway between its two ends, has a few or no actin and myosin filaments. Therefore, this central portion does not contract when the ends do. Instead, it functions as a sensory receptor. The receptor portion of the muscle spindle is its central portion. In this area, the interfusal muscle fibers do not have myosin and actin contractile elements. They are stimulated by stretching of this mid portion of the spindle. One can readily see that the muscle spindle receptor can be excited in two ways. First, lengthening the whole muscle stretches the mid portion of the spindle and therefore excites the receptor. Two, even if the length of the entire muscle does not change, contraction of the end portion of the spindle's intrafusal fiber stretches the mid portion of the spindle and therefore excites the receptor. Two types of sensory endings are found in this central receptor area of the muscle spindle. They are the primary ending and the secondary ending. First, the primary ending in the central of the receptor area, a large sensory nerve fiber encircles the central portion of each interfusal fiber, and it transmits sensory signals to the spinal cord at a velocity of 70 to 120 meters per second, as rapidly as any type of nerve fiber in the entire body. Second, secondary ending, usually one but sometimes two smaller sensory nerve fibers, type 2 fibers, innervate the receptor region on one or both sides of the primary ending.
Stretch reflex. The simplest manifestation of muscle spindle function is the muscle stretch reflex. Whenever a muscle is stretched suddenly, excitation of the spindles causes reflex contraction of the large skeletal muscle fibers of the stretched muscle and also of closely allied synergistic muscles. In this scheme, it's an example of stretch reflex, patellar reflex. Me and my friend Amin will explain the steps of this reflex.
If we hit the tendon by a small hammer, it will stimulate the muscle to stretch. It will send a stimulus via the sensory neuron enters the spinal cord via the dorsal roots to the gray matter, which will Yes?
Within the spinal cord, the sensory neuron activates motor neuron, which will be excited and travels to the muscle and causes its contraction and relieves the stretching. And the connection between the sensory and the motor neuron is called monosynaptic because there is no interneuron.
The opposite side of the muscle, that we have the antagonist muscle. The antagonist muscle will get relaxed because if we go back to the sensory neuron, it enters the gray matter, it will branch to two. The other branch will connect with an interneuron. It is an inhibitory interneuron, which will connect with the motor neuron to this muscle, antagonist muscle, and make it relaxed. This process of one muscle relaxed and the other muscle is contracting is called reciprocal, which we talked before.
Yes, and as we can see, the signals entering the spinal cord and exiting are from the same side, so we call it ipsilateral.
The Golgi tendon reflex. Golgi tendon organ helps control muscle tension. The Golgi tendon organ is an encapsulated sensory receptor through which the muscle tendon fibers pass. The organ is stimulated when this small bundle of muscle fibers is tensed by contracting or stretching the muscle. Thus, the major difference in excitation of the Golgi tendon organ versus the muscle spindle is that the spindle detects muscle length and changes in muscle length, whereas the tendon organ detects muscle tension as reflected by the tension in itself. The tendon organ, like the primary receptor of the muscle spindle, has both a dynamic response and a static response, reacting intensely when the muscle tension suddenly increases, the dynamic response, but settling down with a fraction of a second to a lower level of steady-state firing that is almost directly proportional to the muscle tension, the static response. The tendon reflex prevents excessive tension on the muscle. When the Golgi tendon organs of a muscle tendon are stimulated by increased tension in the connecting muscle, signals are transmitted to the spinal cord to cause reflex effects in the respective muscle. This reflex is entirely inhibitory. Thus, this reflex provides a negative feedback mechanism that prevents the development of too much tension on the muscle. When tension on the muscle and therefore on the tendon becomes extreme, the inhibitory effect from the tendon organ can be so great that it leads to a sudden reaction in the spinal cord that causes instantaneous relaxation of the entire muscle. This effect is called the lengthening reaction. This is probably a protective mechanism to prevent tearing of the muscle or avulsion of the tendon from its attachment to the bone. In this picture, we can see an example for the tendon reflex. Me and my friend Stephanie will explain it to you. If we hit the tendon a little bit too hard, it will get stimulated, but the tendon organ will get stimulated this time, and it will cause the muscle to send and excite and it will send a stimulus via the sensory neuron via the dorsal roots.
Yes, to the spinal cord, to the gray matter of the spinal cord. And within the spinal cord, the sensory neuron activates an inhibitory interneuron, which will go and innervates the muscle attached to the same tendon, and which will cause its relaxation and relieves excess tension.
On the opposite side of this muscle, we have the antagonist muscle. The antagonist muscle will contract. This will cause, if we go back to the to this sensory neuron, it enters the gray matter, it will cause another synapse with an excitatory interneuron, which will make this antagonist muscle contract. Again, this is called, when we have if we have one muscle contracts and the other muscle relax, is called reciprocal.
And as we can see, the sensory neuron entering the spinal cord and the motor neuron exiting the spinal cord are the same side, which is called ipsilateral. Now the flexor reflex. In the spinal or decerebrate animal, almost any type of cutaneous sensory stimulus from a limb is likely to cause the flexor muscles of the limb to contract, thereby withdrawing the limb from the stimulating object. This reflex is called the flexor reflex. If some part of the body other than one of the limbs is painfully stimulated, that part will similarly be withdrawn from the stimulus, but the reflex may not be confined to flexor muscles, even though it's basically the same type of reflex. Therefore, the many patterns of these reflexes in the different areas of the body are called withdrawal reflexes. For example, a painful stimulus is applied to the hand. As a result, the flexor muscles of the upper arm become excited, thus withdrawing the hand from the painful stimulus. Crust extensor reflex. About 0.2 to 0.5 seconds after a stimulus elicits a flexor reflex in one limb, the opposite limb begins to extend. This reflex is called the crust extensor reflex. Extension of the opposite limb can push the entire body away from the object, causing the painful stimulus in the withdrawn limb, demonstrating that signals from sensory nerves cross to the opposite side of the cord to excite extensor muscles. Because the crust extensor reflex usually does not begin until 200 to 500 milliseconds after onset of the initial pain stimulus, it's certain that many interneurons are involved in the circuit between the incoming sensory neuron and the motor neurons of the opposite side of the cord responsible for the crust extension. After the painful stimulus is removed, the crust extensor reflex has an even longer period of after discharge than does the flexor reflex.
In this picture, we can see an example for the flexor withdrawal and the crust extensor. If we step on a track or something harmful to us, on this side of the picture we have the right leg. It will cause the withdrawal of this leg. If we step on something hard or something will get pain or something maybe harm us, it will send a sensory stimulus via the sensory neuron to the spinal cord and towards the dorsal root and to the gray matter. To the gray matter, it will have a connection with the interneuron to send a motor function excitatory to the muscle here. It is a big muscle. So if it's a big muscle, we need more than one neuron. So it will goes up ascending and down descending. And both these three will cause the muscle to contract and withdraw the right leg. On the opposite side, we have the left leg. The left leg will contract. How? When the sensory here will get to the spinal cord via the gray matter, it will go to the other side, exit via the other side via the motor neuron to this big muscle, large muscle again. We need more than one neuron like the flexor withdrawal, so it will goes up ascending and down descending and will help these motor neurons will recruit and help this muscle contract and extend the left leg. We can mention that the crust extensor is a contralateral because it enters from one side and exits from one side. The flexor is ipsilateral because it enters from one side and exits from one side. And at the end, my friends will conclude us.
Conclusion. The spinal cord transmits nerve impulses to and from the brain and mediates several important reflexes. It also coordinates more complex motor sequences. Reflexes protect your body from things that you can harm it. For example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, a reflex causes you to immediately remove your hand. It also plays a very important role within the equilibrium points hypothesis. Thank you.
At the end, this is the sources we used. Thank you for attention. Goodbye.